Leviticus 25. That's where the Torah portion started today. Talking about vineyards and rest and how that all kind of works. But when you think about the United States, we're not as much of an agricultural community or civilization as we used to be. But for the longest time, we were an agricultural civilization and economy. That didn't really begin to change for us until times after the Civil War, when industrialization really started to kick in, began to increase and dominate. But farming was still the main and primary way of life to most Americans on some level, at least until the 1950s, right? And there's probably wiggle room on a lot of that, but everybody was involved more with growing their own food and their own things, and that started to change for us in the last couple of generations. But this whole idea of being this agricultural civilization, this agricultural-based economy, that was very true for Yeshua and his era, the New Testament era, and for most of human history. That's why so many of his teachings centered around farming and agriculture, because everyone was connected to it in some way. Everyone really participated in the agriculture in some way, even if it was only during a harvest season. I mean, we talk about Peter and so many of the disciples being fishermen. But I bet at certain times of the year, they put their nets down and went out and worked in the fields to help their friends, to help their family. Uh-oh. Is that the police coming for us? Well, it's a small force anyway. I think we can take them. But in any event, that was, even the disciples probably put down their nets for certain times of the year to go help with the harvest. And Yeshua taught a lot of his parables were on that. This is Luke chapter 13. Can y'all see this okay? Y'all read that? Yes. It says, "Then Yeshua began telling this parable. A man had a fig tree he had planted in his vineyard, and he came looking for fruit on it and found none. So he said to the gardener, 'Indeed, for 3 years I have come searching for fruit on this fig tree and found none. Remove it. Why does it use up the ground?' But answering, the gardener said to him, 'Master, leave it alone for this year also, until I dig around it and apply fertilizer, and if it bears fruit, good, but if not, cut it down.'" He had another parable in Matthew chapter 21, where he says, "Listen to another parable. There was a master of a household who planted a vineyard, and he put a hedge around it, dug a winepress in it, built a tower. Then he leased it to some tenant farmers and went on a journey. Now when fruit season drew near, he sent his servants to the tenants to collect his fruit." So some things to notice in these parables, when you look at it, so the symbolism of things, the master or the owner, the one who owns and plants the vineyards, who is that supposed to be? That's representative of God, isn't it? That's representative of him. The vineyard that he sets up and protects, what is that? Well, it's Israel, but it's more specifically the land, right? It's the territory that he has in there. That's why the two things symbolize Israel in this. It's the fig tree that he plants in the vineyard, and then it's the tenants that he allows to work the land. Both of those things are representative of the people of Israel themselves. What about the gardener? The gardener represents who? Anyways, the gardener represents Messiah, right? Where he is the one he is interceding, it's his work. He's interceding on behalf of the fig tree as well as nourishing it, but he's also the one at the end that establishes, okay, then if it's not working, then it's time to judge, right? After all, and you think about the gardener, when Mary first came across somebody at the outside of the tomb on the morning of first fruits, what did she call him? The risen Messiah. First, she thought he was the gardener. So he is the gardener. He has been a gardener ever since Eden, ever since the very beginning. So, and yes, we know that Yeshua is known as a carpenter. Some also understand that in terms of being a stonemason. But how many stories and how many parables, how many ways does he teach from being a carpenter or being a stonemason? Does he tell any stories with that? Not really. I can't think of any. So he doesn't talk about those things nearly like he talks about farming and gardening. Gardening seems to, the stonemason or the carpenter seems to be his job, but what he really enjoys to do seems to be the gardening. That seems to be it. I suspect he had a pretty good green thumb. What about y'all? I know I don't. Don't let the garden out there fool you. That's just happening mostly by itself. But even Yeshua, even the Messiah, when he scatters out the seed, when he does things, when he tries to plant, he can't make it all grow to maturity and fruitfulness. Sometimes the seed that he sows lands on the hard and compacted ground, and it doesn't go anywhere. The birds come and they take it up, and nothing happens with it. Sometimes the seed lands on the rocks and dries up quickly, and it never really grows or becomes fruitful. And sometimes the seed lands among the thorns and gets choked out. So even when the master gardener casts out seed, it doesn't always produce a harvest. Only the seed that lands on that cultivated soil grows and produces a harvest 100 times even what was sown. And so what that tells me is that God really does want to produce a harvest among his people. He really does want to see things come to maturity and fruition. He wants to see a harvest of righteousness among us, a harvest that numbers even more than the sands on the shore and the stars in the sky, fulfillment of the promise that he made, a harvest that really is 100 times what was sown, even starting with Abraham. And so it's no wonder that on so many instances that the Father describes his relationship with his people in terms of a vineyard or a garden of some kind of cultivated land in which he sows his people. Psalm 80, verse 9 says this. It says, "You pulled out a vine from Egypt. You drove out nations and planted it. You cleared a place for it, and it took deep root and filled the land." Isaiah chapter 27 says this. It says, "In that day sing to her, a vineyard of delight. I, Adonai, watch over it. I water it every moment. I guard it day and night so that no one may harm it. In days to come, Jacob will take root. Israel will blossom and bud and fill the face of the world with fruit." Can you see that picture of that longing for the harvest? He says in Isaiah chapter 5, "For the vineyard of Adonai Tzavaot, the Lord of hosts, is the house of Israel, and the people of Judah the planting of his delight." So he takes delight in his vineyard. He gives all kinds of care and attention to it, making sure that it has everything that it needs to be fruitful. But consider also the frustration and the disappointment that must happen for this master, the one who owns and plants the vineyard, what he frequently finds. You see this back in chapter 5, verse 1. He says, "Let me sing of my beloved." I mean, he loves the vineyard that he's doing. About his vineyard, "My beloved had a vineyard in a very fertile hill. He dug it out and cleared its stones, planted it with choice vine, but built a tower." This is the same verse. "He dug it out and cleared its stones, planted it with a choice vine, built a tower in the midst of it, and even cut out a winepress. He expected it to yield good grapes, but it yielded worthless grapes." And when you come to this Torah portion in Leviticus, much of this Torah portion is the master of the garden telling his servants how he wants his vineyard cared for. The place that he sets aside. When you come to Leviticus 25, he points out something important about this. It says, "Moreover, the land is not to be sold permanently because the land is mine." So who owns the land? He does, right? Even though they receive some parts of it as inheritance, even though they are put in charge of different portions of it, it's really still his. And he is giving it or allowing them to be there. Verse 50 says, "For Bnei Yisrael are my servants, the children of Israel are my servants whom I brought out of the land of Egypt, for I am Adonai, your God." So we have to understand that we are not the master, nor do we own the vineyard, and nobody does but him. We are to follow his instructions for how he wants it run and how it's going to be cared for. And he takes, because he's the master and we are the servants, he takes full responsibility for providing not only what his vineyard needs, but what his servants need in order to accomplish the task of what he has them for. It's based on them following his instructions, his Torah. That's chapter 25, verse 18. He says, "Therefore you are to keep my statutes and observe my ordinances and carry them out, so that you may live securely in the land. Then the land will yield its fruit, and you may eat your fill and live there in safety." So you see how it's tied. It's tied, experiencing that abundance, experiencing that blessing, experiencing that provision is tied to their observance of his ordinances and his statutes. It goes on in chapter 26, verse 3. He says, "If you walk in my statutes, keep my mitzvot and carry them out, then I will give you rains in their season, the land will yield its crop, and the trees of the field will yield their fruit." Verse 5, "Your threshing will last until grape gathering, the grape gathering will last until the sowing time. You will eat your bread to the full and live securely in your land. I will bring shalom in the land, and you will lie down, with no one making you afraid. I will remove dangerous beasts from the land, and no sword will pass through your land." And so that's an important thing for us to keep in mind. That everything that's happening over there, everything that we hope to be seeing happening over there, of the days of peace and shalom, one of the reasons why we're not seeing it is because, his ways are not really being kept. We're not fully and completely keeping these things at this point, even over in Israel at this time. And so they're following his instructions. Even back then, we're supposed to lead to his protection and provision, but most importantly, it's going to lead to what his heart is, to his presence dwelling in their midst, which has always been his goal, which is always what he's wanted, to living in their midst. This is chapter 26, verse 9. He says, "I will turn toward you, make you fruitful, and multiply you, and I will confirm my covenant with you. You will eat the old harvest and clear out the old because of the new. I will set my tabernacle among you, and my soul will not abhor you. I will walk among you and will be your God, and you will be my people." And you see that similar kind of language even in Jeremiah 31 with the new covenant and such. So this is always his goal. The gardener, the master of the vineyard, wants to live in the garden with his servants. So we must never lose sight that is his desire. That is where he wants to take everything, is that his desire is to dwell with us. That's the promise of the future. That's the kingdom that he talks about even here. And he wants to see this garden that he is doing everything for. He's planting, he's putting up protections around it, he's putting the winepress in it. He wants to see the garden productive and fruitful. And he wants to provide everything for his servants so that they can maximize the harvest that he has. And so to accomplish that goal of maximizing the harvest, he wants things run in certain ways so that the harvest will be full. And so he calls for the land, even in this time, to receive a year of rest, a Shabbat rest, and part of that cycle of every 7 years. This is Leviticus chapter 25, verse 1. It says, "Then Adonai said to Moses on Mount Sinai, Speak to Bnei Israel and tell them, when you come into the land which I give you, then the land is to keep a Shabbat to Adonai. For 6 years you may sow your field, and for 6 years you may prune your vineyard and gather in its fruits. But in the 7th year there is to be a Shabbat rest for the land, a Shabbat to Adonai. You are not to sow your field or prune your vineyard. So remember, the reason why he has the authority to say how his land is going to be run is because he owns it. And so he decrees that every 7 years it is not to be tended, plowed, or harvested like every other year. 6 years they labor on the land, and the 7th year it's supposed to be a time of rest. The 7-year cycle parallels that weekly cycle, just on a larger scale, in the same way that the year of Jubilee, the 50 years, parallels even what we see right now, going on right now, between the time between first fruits and the day of Pentecost. All right, so on the weekly Sabbath, the people are not supposed to do any regular work, but spend that day and that time with him. They are supposed to not make their servants work, but give them and even the animals a day of rest. And so the Father is commanding that on his household, on his property, it's going to be run in the same manner. He expects the same thing of himself that he asks of us, of his things. So he doesn't want his servants working at this time either. So here's the thing. If the Israelites obey and keep the Shemitah, the 7-year cycle of rest for the land, then y'all realize it's not just the land that's resting. Y'all realize that, right? It's not just the land that's getting a break. Because how much of their life is dependent upon all the things that go into planting, sowing, preparing the land, reaping, and all of those things. The servants are also resting in that 7-year cycle. They're not having to do all those things that the land typically would require. They don't have to plow. They don't have to weed or prune. They don't have to do everything else that a normal year requires. So can you imagine, would you like to have a job where every 7 years you get a year off? I'll sign up for that. They'll pay you. They'll provide everything that you need, and you get a whole year off every 7 years. I mean, in the academic world, they have something like that built in. That's called they call that, what do they call that again? A sabbatical? Where'd they get that word? How about that? But they're realizing that it's important to take even extended time off. Because I don't know about you, but one day off, is nice, but it's not always enough, right? So whether they do this or not, whether they go through this process, whether they take that, and imagine you have a whole year where you're not supposed to do that agriculture, where he has promised that he'll provide, enough for you in the year before to last through the whole thing. What would you have the opportunity to do in that year? If it's a pattern from the Sabbath, the weekly Sabbath. On the weekly Sabbath, what are we supposed to do? Meet with each other, fellowship with each other, but fellowship and grow in him. He gives you every 7 years, an entire year, to meet with each other, but to grow in your walk and fellowship with him. That doesn't mean that you have a whole year just to be lazy and do nothing, which is that would last just with this quarantine that we have right now, how many people are going stir crazy because they have nothing to do, or they can't do what they normally feel like they should do. So we're not supposed to just kick back and do nothing all the time, but we're supposed to grow in him. But whether they do this or not really demonstrates how much the servants really trust him to provide and take care of them. He promised that, hey, in that 6th year, I'll give you such an abundant harvest that it will last through that next year and through the time it takes for you to get to the harvest in that following year. And that it's counterintuitive to us. That doesn't make sense to us. If we don't plant anything, then what are we going to eat? Aren't we going to have a food shortage? Aren't we going to starve? How many of y'all are hearing that on the news these days about food shortages of meat and other things like that? We've already been through the toilet paper shortage. We managed to survive. I don't know how, but we did. But do we really believe him? Do we really believe his promise? And God anticipates them asking that question. It's Leviticus 25, verse 20. It says, now if you ask, what are we going to eat during the 7th year? If, see, we are not to sow nor gather in our increase. He says, now I will command my blessing to you in the 6th year, so that it will yield a harvest sufficient for 3 years. When you sow during the 8th year, you will still be eating the old, stored harvest until the harvest of the 9th year comes in. I mean, that takes some trust. That takes some willingness to do this. When you do this, you are putting your life fully and completely in the Master's hand, but he has claimed responsibility for you. He has claimed responsibility for you, and he says that he will provide. And so the question is, do you believe that he who promised is faithful? Will he do it? Now, to our knowledge, the system never really worked. And it's not because he wasn't willing to provide. It's because they never really tried it. They never were really willing to put it into practice. And it still isn't really tried today. I mean, it's talked about, but today a property is merely rented out to someone else for them to work it. A foreigner or an Arab or somebody else like that. They're making other servants work the land, and so the land is not really getting a chance to rest. So why was it never really done? Why was it never really tried? And it reveals something of the heart of the people. It didn't make sense to them, so they didn't do it. And it shows that they didn't really trust him. And they thought of the land more as theirs than God's, and they were going to decide what we do with it. We don't have to answer to somebody else. This is my land, I'm going to do what I want. That they thought that they were the owners and not the tenants. And just as Yeshua mentioned in his parable on the vineyard, the master is going to come and check up on the land from time to time. He's going to send other servants to inspect their work and their faithfulness, and then he's going to act accordingly based upon what they see and what they tell him. That's Matthew chapter 21. And it says, when the fruit season drew near, he sent his servants to the tenants to collect his fruit. But grabbing his servants, the tenants beat up one, and stoned, or killed another, and stoned still another. Again, the master sent other servants, even more than the first, and they did the same thing to them. And of course, it turns out they were not really letting the land rest as the master had told them to do. And there's consequences to that. Leviticus 26:14 says, if you will not listen to me, nor carry out these mitzvot, these commands, and if you reject my statutes, and if your soul abhors my ordinances, so that you do not keep all my mitzvot, but instead break my covenant, then I will do the following to you in return. So he's going to lay out the consequences. And notice how he takes it, how he receives it when they refuse to do it. Ultimately, they refuse to do it because it says they abhor. Their soul abhors his ordinances. They don't really like what he says to do. They don't really agree with it. They think it's foolish. For whatever reason, they abhor his ordinances and his commands. And so the master's discipline comes upon them because they're not doing what he said to do. And his discipline was to cause restoration. His discipline was to return them to fruitful harvest of righteousness. It's like the vine or something else that is growing wild. The gardener, somebody who knows what they're doing, will cut off the branches that aren't growing in the direction or in the way that he thinks they should. He wants to return them to fruitful harvest of righteousness. But if they ignored his correction, you see this all over and over again in chapter 26. If they ignore his corrections, then the next time it gets worse. And 5 times he says it. 5 times he says, if you will not listen, or if in spite of these things, in spite of these hardships that he spells out and he lays out, and if they each time, if they refuse to respond to his discipline, then it's going to increase in intensity the next time it comes, culminating in the exile, culminating in that last step. That's Leviticus chapter 26. So because they don't follow his commands, Leviticus 26:33 says, I will scatter you among the nations, and I will draw out the sword after you. So your land will become a desolation, and your cities will become a waste. So being cast out of the land, being put into exile, is a great punishment. And so they are essentially removed from the garden and the care of the master. And the cause of their exile is the fact that they are abhorring his commands. Is their rejection of his instruction, rejection of his Torah. He's told them that that's why it's going to happen. But the duration of the exile is connected to the Sabbath rest of the land. And he says that in chapter 26, verse 34. It says, Then the land will enjoy its Shabbatot all the days of its desolation, while you are in the land of your enemies. Then the land will enjoy its Shabbatot. And as long as it lies desolate, it will have rest, that rest which it did not have from your Shabbatot when you lived on it. So all those things that you should have been doing, all of that time of rest that you should have provided for it, I'm going to make up for it by not having you in it. And we see that spell itself out, play itself out in the exile of Babylon and things like that. I'm not really going to get into that. But verse 43 goes on. It says, But the land will be deserted by them, and will enjoy its Shabbatot while it lies desolate without them. And they will accept the punishment of their iniquity, because they rejected my ordinances, and their soul abhorred my statutes. And so that means that the commands that we don't understand, even the commands that don't necessarily make sense to us, even the ones that we don't like or agree with, can still have consequences. I'm not one that likes the speed limit laws or whatever else, but just because I don't like it doesn't mean I'm not going to still get a ticket, right? How many of y'all know what I'm talking about? Recently? No, nobody recently? So that's what, whether you agree with it or not, you can still experience the consequences of it. And that's a big debate that's even going on right now. Some of the things that are going on right now, we have to be willing to say, I realize I'm breaking some rule or some expectation that people in authority are putting down, and we have to be prepared to accept the consequences, right? There are some that might not even like what we're doing right now. But we're trying to respect and honor that as best we can, but there are some things that we need to still keep doing anyway. But so even those commands that we don't understand or agree with can still have consequences. And if you ignore his command, if you treat his property with contempt, as if it's yours and not his, then guess what? We should expect some trouble. And as long as Israel is in exile, as long as his people are not in the land, then he is not able to set his tabernacle among them, nor even walk among them. And what's interesting when you look at the perspective, even though Israel in many respects is back in the land today, even though they are in control of Jerusalem, many of them still consider themselves in exile. They still consider their status as exile because they have no tabernacle. They have no temple of God's presence. And until that changes, they still think of themselves as being in exile. And why are they still in exile? Because the discipline has increased. Every time he has sent his prophets, every time he has sent his servants, even as they rejected the prophets sent to them to try to get them to look to the old paths, to follow the ways of the Lord and his commands, the more times that he sent the prophets, the next time it increased even greater, until finally he sent his son. Matthew 21 says, finally, this is that parable of Yeshua. He sent his son to them, saying, they will respect my son. But when the tenants saw the son, they said among themselves, this is the heir. Come, let us kill him and get his inheritance. So grabbing him, they threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. Verse 40 says, therefore, when the master of the vineyard comes, what will he do to those tenants? And the answer from the man who was asking the question says, he will bring those miserable men to a miserable end, they said to him, and will lease the vineyard to other tenants who will give him his share of the fruit in their seasons. See how important this is, especially when you reject the Son. When you reject the Messiah whom he sends, there are extended, long-term, escalated consequences for that. And in that meantime, other tenants will be there. But the goal that he says, he will lease the vineyard to other tenants who will give him his share of the fruits in their season. So again, the goal, the fruitful harvest, is important. But again, how does the fruitful harvest come about? It occurs through obedience and then acceptance of the Son. That's how a fruitful harvest really takes place. And the new tenants may have accepted the Son, which is key. But we as the Gentiles, in some ways these new tenants, are we particularly obedient? Not particularly. On some things, yeah, we don't realize how much of the commandments we really do keep. We don't really realize how much of the Torah we keep. We do that without, more unintentionally. There's those sacrifices for the unintentional sins. Well, there seems to be something to be said for unintentional obedience. Because he seems to be giving us a break on a lot of things. More than we deserve, that's for sure. But both of those things are necessary. Acceptance of the Son and obedience to his command. That's how Revelation put it. Those that survive, those who endure to the end, are the ones who keep his commandments and hold to the testimony of Yeshua. Both of those elements are necessary for us to truly experience fruitfulness. And as fruitful as we may have been, as Gentiles and such, we're not as fruitful as we should be. We are not as accomplished for the kingdom of God as we should be, because we have accepted Messiah, but we have not really obeyed and followed his commands. And God wants to demonstrate his faithfulness. Again, it comes back to him and what he wants to do, and what he wants to do in us. He wants to fulfill all of the promises that he made. He wants to pour out his blessing and his abundance upon his people. And so as much as the Jewish people want to return from exile and enjoy his presence in their midst, as much as they want that, we have to realize that that's even more God's heart and desire than it is even there. He wants to see that happen all the more. Restoring them from exile is his desire. And that's why his purpose and discipline, even in exile, is always about restoring that relationship and that place in the garden. That's Leviticus 26, verse 40. He says, but if they confess their iniquity and that of their fathers in the treachery they committed against me, and how they walked contrary to me, in return I walked contrary to them and brought them into the land of their enemies, and if at that time their uncircumcised heart becomes humbled, so that they accept the punishment for their iniquity, says, then I will remember my covenant with Jacob, and also my covenant with Isaac, and my covenant with Abraham, and I will remember the land. I will remember the land. That's so much of what his heart is. They confess, and we ought to be a part of this as well. Confessing our iniquity and that of our fathers. We have to confess and talk about the iniquity for decisions that were made that you didn't even necessarily make, but that were made for you generations before. And when he truly restores the Jewish people, because that's backing up a little bit, we have accepted the Son, but we are living with iniquity and rebellion against him based on decisions made a long time ago. And we've talked about that before. And when he restores the Jewish people, we will be included because we have accepted the Son. But both Jew and Gentile, we need to confess our iniquity and that of our fathers that came before us in those decisions that were made. You know, for them, it was their fathers and such that rejected him as Messiah. For us, it's for many of us who live in the legacy of rejecting his commandments. Both of us have to have our eyes open. Both of us have to experience his discipline. Both of us have to be humbled and have an uncircumcised heart. Both of us must be willing to receive rebuke and correction in order to fully enjoy his presence in our midst, which is where everything is going, which is the kingdom of God. That's where he wants to take us. That's the goal. That's the finish line of things, is where his presence, you know, heaven comes down and glory fills my soul, kind of a thing. That's where it all is pointing toward. And what a day that will be. What a day that will be. How we will rejoice in him. Right now, we Gentiles are benefiting from the rejection of Messiah. Romans 9 through 11 talks about a lot of that. But what will their acceptance be but life from the dead? That's also how he talks about it there. Yes, they've rejected it for this time. Yes, there is a blindness at this time. But as we see the blindness coming off, and there's more and more that are accepting him, man, the things that God is going to do. What will their acceptance be but life from the dead? And in that day, he's using in a lot of ways the language of the Feast of Tabernacles. The vineyard will be fruitful and ready for harvesting. His servants will be faithfully gathering in the bounty from the four corners of the earth, and that fruitful harvest will be brought into the Father's house, where there will be great joy and celebration. That's what we should expect. That's what we should be looking forward to. Don't we want to be a part of that? Isn't that something we should be talking about all the more? Isn't that something we should be getting into the forefront, into people's attention? Don't you want to be brought back, to be gathered at the end of the exile? See, he says he will remember his covenant with Jacob, and also my covenant with Isaac, and my covenant with Abraham, and I will remember the land. That's what we need to be praying for. That's what we need to be looking forward to. That may we see his land at rest. And may his land be at rest so his people can experience their rest. And that's that Sabbath rest that is to come for the people of God. All of these things are connected. We may look and read at Leviticus and try to figure out, well, what does that have to do with us? And he is outlining our hope. He is outlining what he wants to do in the lives of his people in the future, in the kingdom of God. When we live in the kingdom of God, do you think the land is going to experience a Shabbat rest every 7 years? Yeah, that's the way he wants his land to be run. Is there going to be a 50th year Jubilee? Yes, that's the way he wants it to run. And in the 6th year, leading up to that 7th year, is he going to provide enough of a harvest for the entire time? Yes, that's what the kingdom is going to look like. That's how it's going to function. What we're looking for here is what the kingdom is how it's going to operate. This is the future that he's laying out. And if you don't want to have anything to do with this, you think this is not really for you, then in a lot of ways, you're saying that you really don't want to be a part of his kingdom. You abhor his commands, is what it comes down to. And I don't want to be that person. I don't want to be that kind of people. May we see his land at rest, so that we as his people can experience the Shabbat rest that is to come for the people of God.